It was supposed to be my fresh start. After years of saving, cutting corners, and enduring the questionable living conditions of my old apartment, where the upstairs neighbor apparently trained for the Olympic hammer throw at 2 a.m., I finally bought my dream home. A real house with a backyard, a driveway, and the one thing I'd longed for most, peace. No more mysterious water leaks from the ceiling. No more shared walls with a guy who cooked fish at all hours of the night. Just me, my own space, and a quiet suburban neighborhood where nothing dramatic ever happened. Or so I thought. The first week was bliss. Mornings were spent sipping coffee on the porch, admiring the perfectly lined-up mailboxes and pristine lawns. Evenings were peaceful, aside from the occasional dog barking or distant sound of a lawnmower humming like white noise in the background. It was exactly what I had imagined, until I met my neighbor. Her name was Karen. Of course it was. I should have known something was off when I caught her peering at me through her blinds while I was unloading my boxes. The curtain snapped shut the moment our eyes met, but I could still feel the judgment radiating from her window. An hour later, just as I was setting up my TV, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find a woman in her late 50s, her hair cut in a severe bob that didn't move despite the slight breeze. She had the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile, just a mechanical arrangement of lips designed to imply politeness. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said, handing me a small pamphlet. I glanced down at it. Homeowners Association Guidelines, Community Standards and Regulations. Oh boy. Thanks, I said, trying to match her forced smile. "I hope you'll be following all the rules," she added sweetly, though there was something unnervingly icy about her tone. "We like to keep things uniform here." "Sure," I said, already regretting this entire exchange. She leaned in slightly. "That fence of yours, for example. We don't usually allow rustic styles. They clash with the aesthetic." It took everything in me not to laugh. The rustic fence she was referring to was literally just a wooden fence. A normal fence. Not neon pink. Not covered in barbed wire. Just a fence. "I'll look into it," I said, hoping that would satisfy her. It did not. Over the next few days, I noticed Karen's presence everywhere. She walked the neighborhood with a clipboard, jotting things down as she peered at people's yards like some kind of suburban overlord. She even had binoculars. Binoculars. It was as if running the HOA had unlocked some deep, dictatorial instinct inside of her. But it wasn't until the power outage that things really got strange. It happened on a Tuesday night. 1 second, I was microwaving leftovers, and the next, my entire house plunged into darkness. At first, I assumed it was a standard blackout, but then I noticed something weird. The houses across the street still had power. I grabbed my phone and stepped outside. The streetlights were on. The Joneses still had their tacky Christmas lights blinking despite it being March, and Karen's house, directly next to mine, was glowing like a beacon of judgment. So why was my house the only one that had lost power? I checked the breaker box, hoping for an easy fix. No luck. Everything seemed normal. Confused, I made my way to the side of the house where the electric meter was, just to see if I could spot anything unusual. And that's when I saw it. A thick, black cable running from my meter to Karen's house. I stared at it for a full 10 seconds, trying to process what I was looking at. Surely this wasn't, was it? Oh, it was. Karen was stealing my electricity. I took a deep breath, because this was so much worse than an ugly fence dispute. This wasn't just HOA nonsense. This was an actual crime. A cartoon villain-level crime. I could almost hear her saying, "Aha, foolish neighbor, you'll never suspect a thing." Before I could even think about how to handle this, I heard the sound of a door creaking open. Karen stepped onto her porch, arms crossed, watching me like she'd been expecting me to figure it out. "Something wrong?" she called, her voice dripping with mock concern. "Oh, you know," I said, gesturing vaguely. "Just wondering why my electricity is being siphoned into your house." She gasped, clutching her chest in theatrical outrage. "Excuse me? Are you accusing me of something?" I pointed at the obvious cable. "Karen, there is a wire running from my house to yours." Her expression barely changed. "That's ridiculous." I stared at her. She stared back. The cable was right there. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, she flipped her attitude completely. "Well," she huffed, "if there was some kind of mix-up, I'm sure it was an accident. The HOA handles these things, not me." "Oh, right. The HOA. Of course. So you're saying the HOA mistakenly plugged my electricity into your house?" "Exactly." I pressed my fingers to my temples. "You do realize I can report this, right?" Karen didn't even flinch. Report what? There's no proof. I pointed at the actual physical evidence once more, but Karen just smirked. I realized then that this was a woman who had spent years getting away with nonsense like this, bending rules in whatever way suited her, and she had absolutely no fear of being held accountable. But I wasn't about to let this slide. Fine, I said, pulling out my phone and snapping a picture. I guess the police will be the ones to sort it out. Karen's expression twitched just slightly. For the first time, there was a hint of something resembling unease. There's no need to escalate things, she said quickly. I'm sure we can work something out. I folded my arms. Oh, like what? She hesitated, then waved a dismissive hand. I'll have someone from the HOA look into it tomorrow. Yeah, sure she would. I turned and headed back toward my house, already planning my next move. Because if Karen thought she was going to pull one over on me, she was in for a very rude awakening. As I walked inside, I realized something else. This wasn't just about electricity. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my doorbell ringing in rapid, aggressive bursts, like whoever was on the other side was trying to summon a medieval servant. I groggily stumbled to the door, half expecting to find Karen with another thinly veiled threat about the neighborhood's aesthetic integrity. Instead, I was greeted by a man in a wrinkled utility company uniform, looking about one bad cup of coffee away from quitting his job entirely. You the homeowner? He asked, glancing at his clipboard. Yes. He let out a tired sigh, already flipping through pages. Right. We got a report that your meter might have been tampered with. I blinked. You don't say. Oh, I do say, he muttered. Neighbor called it in. My eyes narrowed. Which neighbor? He shrugged. Lady next door. Real chatty. Kept going on about how she suspected something was wrong with your setup and how she was concerned for the neighborhood's energy efficiency. Of course she did. I plastered on a polite smile. Well, you're welcome to check, but I already know the problem. Someone, and I'm not naming names, but let's just say she has an HOA-issued clipboard permanently attached to her hand, has been helping herself to my electricity. The utility worker raised an eyebrow, clearly unfazed by whatever suburban power struggle he had walked into. Happens more than you think. That was deeply unsettling. With a grunt, he followed me around to the side of the house, where the thick black cable was still very much plugged into my meter, snaking its way toward Karen's house like a cartoonish representation of villainy. The worker scratched his head. Well, that's definitely not supposed to be there. You don't say. He ignored my sarcasm, pulling out a tool belt and getting to work. I watched as he traced the cable, checking where it connected to Karen's house. He paused, then let out a short, bitter laugh. Oh, she's bold. I crossed my arms. How bad is it? Not only did she tap into your line, but she tried to cover it up with a fake HOA authorization sticker. That was so perfectly, ridiculously Karen that I actually had to take a second to process it. She faked an authorization sticker? Yup. Not even a good one. Wrong font. I pressed a hand to my forehead. So what now? Well, first I disconnect it, he said, already yanking the cable loose. Then I report it to the company. Could be fines. Could be a police matter. That's up to you. I could already picture Karen's reaction. She'd either deny everything or claim it was all a misunderstanding. And by misunderstanding, she'd probably mean she got caught and now needed an excuse. Before I could respond, we both heard the unmistakable sound of her front door swinging open. Oh, wonderful, I muttered. Karen came marching across her perfectly manicured lawn, her lips pursed in an expression that suggested she had already rehearsed a speech about why this was all my fault. Excuse me, she said, her voice sickly sweet. But what exactly do you think you're doing? The utility worker, clearly immune to HOA-level nonsense, gestured to the now disconnected cable. Fixing an unauthorized power tap. Karen's smile didn't falter. Well, that's simply ridiculous. I called because I was concerned about an anomaly with the electricity. I didn't expect you to come and start making baseless accusations. I let out a short laugh, folding my arms. Karen, there was a literal cable stealing my power. It wasn't exactly a hidden mystery. She waved a hand dismissively. How do we know you didn't install it yourself and are now trying to cover it up? People do desperate things when they can't afford their bills. The sheer audacity of it nearly left me speechless. The worker, however, had had enough. Lady, the fake sticker gave it away. Karen's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. She was scrambling, trying to find a way to spin this, but there was no getting out of it. I don't know how that got there, she finally said, but the usual confidence in her voice had wavered. The worker jotted something on his clipboard. Well, the company's gonna investigate. Could be fines. Could be fraud charges. Karen stiffened at the word fraud. I smiled. That's funny, Karen. You're so passionate about making sure everyone in the neighborhood follows the rules. And yet here you are. She narrowed her eyes. Don't act like you're some kind of hero. You've been a problem ever since you moved in. I blinked. Because I had a fence you didn't like? And the garbage cans, she snapped. You left them out an extra hour last week. Do you know what that does to the neighborhood's image? I turned to the worker, who looked deeply, profoundly done with this entire situation. Do you hear that? I left my garbage cans out for an extra hour. Truly, I am a menace to society. Karen folded her arms, straightening like she still had some level of authority over the situation. This is all a misunderstanding. I'll speak to the HOA board and have this sorted. The worker gave her a long, unimpressed look. Uh-huh, you do that. With that, he snapped his clipboard shut and gave me a nod. We'll be in touch. As he walked off, Karen turned her icy glare on me. You think you've won? I grinned. Oh, Karen. I know I have. She huffed, spun on her heel, and stormed back toward her house. I watched her go, shaking my head at the sheer nerve of the woman. But something told me this wasn't over. Karen had spent years getting her way, bending rules, twisting situations to suit her. And now, for the first time, she'd been caught. People like her don't take losses lightly. And I had a feeling she was already planning her next move. The following morning, I woke up expecting to find a letter from the HOA on my doorstep. It wasn't paranoia, it was just experience. Karen was the type of person who didn't take well to being called out, and considering she'd been caught literally stealing my electricity, I was sure she'd be pulling whatever petty move she could to retaliate. Sure enough, when I opened my front door, there it was, an official-looking envelope stamped with the HOA logo, sitting smugly on my welcome mat like it had been personally delivered by Karen's righteous fury. I sighed, picked it up, and opened it right there on the porch. Notice of violation. Dear homeowner, it has come to the attention of the Homeowners Association that your exterior lighting is in violation of neighborhood standards. Properly maintained and HOA-compliant outdoor lighting is crucial to the aesthetic integrity of the community. Failure to address this issue within 7 days may result in additional fines. Sincerely, Karen Blake, HOA President. I reread the letter twice just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Exterior lighting? The lighting that had gone out because she had been stealing my power? Oh, she was good. I had to give her that. With a deep breath, I crumpled the letter and tossed it into my recycling bin. I wasn't about to play her game. If she wanted to waste her time writing up fake violations, fine. But I had bigger things to deal with, like the fact that the utility company was still investigating, and I hadn't heard a word about whether or not Karen was going to face any actual consequences. I was still thinking about this later that afternoon when I spotted my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Clark, watering her flowers. Mrs. Clark had been in the neighborhood for at least 30 years and had the kind of gentle grandmotherly energy that made you feel like she probably always had freshly baked cookies in her kitchen. She gave me a knowing smile as I walked over. So, she said, adjusting her sun hat, I take it you got a little love letter from the HOA? I sighed. Let me guess, you got one too? Oh, honey, she chuckled. I've been getting them for years. That made me pause. Wait, years? She nodded, shaking her head as she sprayed her hydrangeas with the hose. Karen's been pulling this nonsense since she became president. If she doesn't like you, she'll find a reason to slap you with a fine. Last year, she tried to fine me because my bird feeder was too rustic. I blinked. Too rustic? I know. Real scandalous stuff. I rubbed my temples. So she just makes stuff up? She always makes stuff up, Mrs. Clark sighed. And if you try to fight back, she just doubles down. The woman has a list of people she's got it out for. I guarantee you, now that you've crossed her, you're officially on it. I exhaled slowly. Fantastic. Mrs. Clark gave me a sympathetic pat on the shoulder. But if you're looking to even the score, I might have something for you. I raised an eyebrow. Oh, she nodded, glancing around before lowering her voice. Karen's not as squeaky clean as she wants people to think. I've got some friends who've been collecting evidence for years. If you're serious about taking her down, you might want to have a little chat with them. I didn't even hesitate. Give me names. That's how I ended up at Dawn's house that evening. Don was a retired contractor who had lived in the neighborhood long before Karen arrived and had apparently been at war with her ever since. The moment I stepped inside, he handed me a beer and a thick folder labeled HOA Corruption. "You're the guy she tried to scam with the electricity, right?" he asked, sitting down in his recliner. "That's me," I confirmed, flipping open the folder. "Well, welcome to the club," he said, shaking his head. "We've all had run-ins with her. She's been running this place like her own little kingdom for years. And let me tell you, she's dirty. Really dirty." I skimmed through the folder, my eyebrows raising higher with each page. Illegal fines. Unapproved budget spending. HOA funds mysteriously disappearing without explanation. "This is insane," I muttered. "Oh, you haven't even gotten to the good part yet," Don smirked. "Check the last few pages." I flipped toward the end and stopped cold. There it was. A document showing that Karen had personally approved a series of neighborhood fees that had never been voted on. "Let me guess," I said slowly, looking up. "None of these fees ever went toward actual maintenance." "Bingo," Don said. "We've been trying to get enough people together to formally challenge her, but most folks are too scared. She bullies the HOA board into voting her way, and anyone who speaks up gets harassed with fines and threats." I sat back, processing everything. This wasn't just an annoying neighbor with too much time on her hands. This was real corruption. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I wasn't just mad about the electricity anymore. I was going to take Karen down. "You in?" Don asked, watching me. I took a slow sip of my beer and nodded. "Oh, I'm in." We spent the next 2 hours plotting. Step 1, gather all the evidence. Step 2, get other homeowners to testify. Step 3, call for an emergency HOA vote to remove her from power. "And if that doesn't work?" I asked. Don grinned. "Then we go nuclear." I didn't know exactly what that meant, but I was very excited to find out. By the time I left, I had a plan, a folder full of incriminating documents, and a newfound sense of purpose. Karen had spent years terrorizing this neighborhood, but she had finally messed with the wrong homeowner. She wanted a fight? She was about to get one. The plan went into motion the very next day. I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that I wasn't just dealing with a power-hungry HOA president anymore. I was dealing with a full-blown suburban tyrant. Karen had spent years manipulating the system, finding people for imaginary infractions, and now, thanks to Don's collection of incriminating evidence, I had everything I needed to bring her down. But first, I needed to rally the troops. By mid-morning, I was knocking on doors, armed with copies of key documents that proved Karen had been misusing HOA funds. Some neighbors hesitated, worried about retaliation, but once I showed them the actual numbers of how much Karen had funneled into miscellaneous expenses, translation, her personal projects, I started getting real interest. Mrs. Clark was the first to sign on. Then Don. Then the Millers from down the street, who had apparently been fined 3 separate times for excessively festive holiday decorations. By noon, I had a dozen people willing to confront the HOA board, and that number kept growing. But just as I was feeling good about my chances, I saw her. Karen, standing in her driveway, watching me. The way her arms were crossed, the way her expression twisted into that smug, knowing smirk, I could feel the storm brewing. She knew something was up. I decided to take the direct approach. I walked over, stopping just on the edge of her property. "Karen." "Neighbor," she replied, her voice saccharine sweet. "You've been busy this morning." "Yeah. Seems like people around here are really interested in how the HOA has been handling things." Her smile didn't falter. "Oh dear. Are you trying to stir up trouble?" I raised an eyebrow. "You mean the same way you did when you stole my electricity?" Her eyes flickered, just for a second, but she recovered quickly. "That was a misunderstanding, and you know it. But if you insist on making things difficult, well, let's just say the HOA has ways of dealing with disruptive elements." "Oh, disruptive elements? That was a threat." "See, Karen, I think you've got a bigger problem," I said, tilting my head. "I think you're finally outnumbered." Her lips twitched, but she forced another condescending smile. "We'll see about that." Then she turned and walked inside. I didn't know what she was planning, but I had a feeling I was about to find out. ####. That night, the retaliation began. First, Don called to tell me his trash hadn't been picked up, just his. The truck had come down the street, collected everyone else's bins, and skipped his house entirely. Then the Millers found an HOA warning in their mailbox for an unauthorized lawn ornament. The ornament in question? A garden gnome. By the time I checked my own mailbox, I wasn't even surprised to find another notice of violation waiting for me. Infraction. Parking violation. Details. Your vehicle was parked 2.5 inches over the approved driveway boundary. Asterisk asterisk. Action required. Immediate correction to avoid fines. 2.5 inches. I stared at the letter for a long moment before letting out a slow, deep breath. Karen was fighting back the only way she knew how, with petty bureaucratic nonsense. But the thing was, I expected this. I had already taken the next step, filing an official motion for an emergency HOA vote to remove her as president. With the number of complaints piling up, the board had no choice but to at least hear the case. The meeting was set for Friday night. Karen had 4 days left in power. And she knew it. ####. By Friday, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. People whispered in driveways. Cars slowed down in front of my house. Someone even taped a homemade sign to the community bulletin board that read, "End the reign of Karen." By the time I arrived at the HOA meeting, the community center was packed. I wasn't expecting a full-blown spectacle, but that's exactly what it had turned into. Karen sat at the head of the long table, dressed in an aggressive shade of beige, her arms crossed as she watched me approach. To her left were the HOA board members, most of whom I suspected were either terrified of her or directly benefiting from her nonsense. The board president cleared his throat. "We're here tonight to address the request for an emergency vote regarding HOA leadership." Karen let out an exaggerated sigh. "Honestly, this is all so ridiculous." I stepped forward, placing a thick stack of documents on the table. "Then you won't mind if I go through the evidence, right?" The next 10 minutes were glorious. I walked the entire room through everything. The unauthorized fees, the made-up violations, the funds that had mysteriously vanished under her leadership. Every page I flipped made Karen's expression tighten just a little more. And then Dawn stood up. She fined me for fixing my own mailbox. And then Mrs. Clark added, she tried to evict me because she didn't like my bird feeder. And then the Millers held up a photo of the excessively festive holiday decorations that had gotten them fined. A single string of white lights. The room erupted into murmurs. For the first time, Karen looked nervous. "This is all just speculation," she snapped. "You can't just..." I held up the final document, the one that showed she had funneled HOA funds into a maintenance project that never actually happened. That shut her up. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. The president sighed. "We'll take a vote." It wasn't even close. Karen was officially removed as HOA president. And just like that, her little empire collapsed. ####. The fallout was immediate. Karen tried to fight the decision, of course. She threatened lawsuits, tried to claim it was a witch hunt, but the evidence was too overwhelming. By the end of the month, the HOA had formally banned her from holding any leadership position ever again. Then came the fines, the legal trouble, the massive dent in her reputation. And finally, the for sale sign appeared in her front yard. I saw her one last time on the day she moved out. She stood on her porch, glaring at me as the movers loaded up the last of her things. I waved. She flipped me off. I smiled. And as her car finally drove out of the neighborhood, I took a deep breath and exhaled, knowing one thing for certain. Peace had finally returned. And this time, it was here to stay. What would you have done if you caught your neighbor stealing your electricity? Have you ever had a nightmare HOA experience? Share your story. What's the pettiest rule you've ever heard of in an HOA or a neighborhood community? Do you think Karen got what she deserved, or should the punishment have been even worse? If you were in charge of the HOA, what's the first rule you would get rid of? Do you think HOAs are helpful, or do they give too much power to people like Karen? What do you think? Was this the ultimate HOA revenge, or would you have taken it even further? Let me know in the comments. Thumbs up if you enjoyed the story. Don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Bell, and if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to HOA Havoc for more insane HOA and entitled neighbor stories. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Speech Balloon, let me know where you're watching from. I love seeing how far our community reaches.